Welcome to the Tax Professionals Podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Tax Professionals Podcast. Delegation is one of those skills that, once mastered, will become an exceptionally useful tool for you. It will help you to progress, develop, and get more out of your tax career, as well as help to improve your work-life balance if this is something you desire. But if you've had an opportunity to delegate, you've probably encountered a situation where delegation hasn't gone to plan, leaving you feeling frustrated, annoyed, and like it's quicker to do the work yourself. You're definitely not alone with that experience. Delegation is a skill, and like any other skill, it must be learned, developed, and improved over time. In this episode, Mike Clayton, from his extensive experience as a business trainer, author, and speaker in helping professionals, managers, and leaders to excel, provides some great insights and advice so that you can become a better delegator. Let's get to it. Hi, Mike. Thanks for joining me today, and welcome to the Tax Professionals Podcast.
Pleasure to be here, Jack.
It's also a pleasure to have you on the show, especially to talk about delegation, because I think that's an area that a lot of tax professionals find difficult, including me and many who I've actually worked with as well. So when people ask you what you do, how do you usually respond?
I used to, up until relatively recently, describe myself primarily as a trainer and speaker, but I think with the changes that have happened over the last few months, it's solidifying my transition. A lot of what I do now is online, so I'm an online trainer, and therefore I spend most of my time turning the training that I've done over many years into video courses and increasingly into YouTube videos. I have a second channel now. I've had one for a number of years and I've got a second channel. So it's really producing training videos as well as all the writing that I do.
Yeah, because I saw in the past you used to work as a project manager for Deloitte as well, didn't you? Which I think a lot of people will find useful, being tax professionals and Deloitte being a prominent firm there for tax advisors.
Yeah, interestingly, I worked with many parts of the firm. Deloitte's obviously a multifunction firm, and I worked with the accounting practice, with the forensic practice, the corporate finance practice. Unfortunately, as far as I could tell, the tax practice had no use for consultants and project managers, so I never got to work with them. But I'm very familiar with working with accounting professionals of all sorts. So yeah, it's nice to be back with an audience that I know so well.
So one of the courses you've got out at the moment is in relation to delegation, isn't it? So that was one of the reasons I thought it'd be good to get you on the show today to talk about delegation. Okay, so just when it comes to delegation, usually, how would you define it?
I think the important thing to say about delegation is it's entrusting your work to somebody else. What's in there that I think is important is, firstly, it's the entrusting bit. If you aren't able to trust somebody, then you can't delegate to them. You can supervise them heavily, but you can't leave them with your own work, or indeed possibly their own work. But the second thing is, it is your work that you're entrusting. If I've got a group of people and I'm choosing who does what amongst a group of people with complementary skills, then that's allocating work. And we do that all the time as a manager and as a supervisor. But as soon as you decide that you've got people for whom you can entrust your own work, that's when delegation comes to play. So it's entrusting your work to somebody else.
So that's an interesting way to put it, actually, because I suppose when it comes to actually working, I've kind of seen the difference between allocating work and then, as you say, trusting people. And putting that trust in people is much more difficult than just giving them a simple process to follow, isn't it?
Absolutely. I don't know what question you've got in mind, but it seems to me that one of the challenges people always have is that level of trust. It gets in the way of good delegation far too often.
So is there a way that people can improve that trust they have with people that they're going to delegate to?
I think we're wired in different ways as human beings. Some of us are wired that we will just naturally default to trust, but not many of us are wired that way. Others need to experience I suppose, trustworthiness before they can trust. And then the question is, how much trustworthiness do I need to observe? Some of us, one instance, will kind of reset the default. For others, it requires a constant amount of time. And for some people, you know what, we never trust anyone. They're only as good as their last performance. So I think as a manager, we've got to kind of rise above our psychology. Whichever way you're wired, you've got to rise above that and recognize that delegation is an important part of building and growing a team, and therefore you have to act as if people are trustworthy. And if you get good evidence to support that, then that's marvelous. If you get evidence that they aren't trustworthy, then you have to rethink it. But building trust, I think, sometimes starts with just acting as if, recognizing that if I've brought someone into my organization, then there's a lot of trust in that straight away. They're sitting in my office, they are representing my business, and they are holding my reputation in their hands. Giving them a little bit more leverage over that is only an incremental additional risk. The big risk I've taken is the moment I sign a contract of employment with them. We mentioned that I was at Deloitte. I always used to find it quite amusing that we spent so long scrutinizing people's expense claims when they had billions of pounds worth of reputational reputation in their hands every day when they were sitting in our clients' offices, and we were worried about £5.50 on a sandwich. And I'm not arguing that we should never scrutinise expenses and we shouldn't have any audit processes. Far from it, but I think there has to be a balance. I think acting as if you trust people tends to bring out the trustworthiness in them. As soon as I start acting as if I don't trust you, then you're going to behave in strange and unpredictable ways.
Yeah. So when it comes to acting like you trust that person, is there anything that you suggest there can help the other person see that you trust them, and then hopefully they'll reciprocate that trust?
Well, in the context of delegation, giving them good, worthwhile work that they can see has real value and has consequences. So you build up the extent of the consequences of the work you're prepared to delegate. But yeah, giving people good, worthwhile work and letting them figure it out for themselves. You know, most of us learn more from the mistakes we make, than from our successes as we go through our careers. And therefore, as a manager, I don't think it's our job to stop people making mistakes. It's to stop them making the wrong mistakes. This isn't really relevant to accountants or tax professionals, but you know, if you're supervising someone in a workshop, you're not going to say, "There's a giant guillotine that can cut up inch-thick steel. Go figure out how to use it." That's foolish. But there are plenty of things you can say to people. Go figure that out. Do it, and we'll see what happens. And you know there is a chance they will make a mistake. And if you are a good manager, you'll have assessed the mistakes they could make and assessed that the learning value of those mistakes kind of outweighs the time value of putting them right. And so we can use those mistakes to help people learn. So I don't think it's our job to stop people making mistakes in the workplace. So I think you just trust people by picking the job so that there are real consequences to mistakes, but your responsibility to your organisation and to your clients says you have to look at what those consequences are and choose the right thing to delegate in that with that balance in mind.
Yeah, I think the fact that people make mistakes when they're delegated to is probably one of the reasons why people actually resist delegating, because they think, oh, they'll just make a mistake. It might be quicker to do it myself. But that kind of misses the point a bit, doesn't it, anyway? Because, as you say, it helps you to grow your team if you can delegate. And if you never delegate, then I suppose your team will be stuck the same size and you won't be able to get to other pieces of work as well. So is there any other reasons you think that people resist delegating? And are there any reasons why these shouldn't be true reasons?
Okay, I mean, I think the main reasons why people resist delegating. I mean, you can come up with a whole long list, and I expect, and you know, in my training, I do exercises over it, but I think it all boils down to two things: it's trust, which we've talked of, and control. I will resist delegating if I don't feel I can trust you, and I will also resist delegating if I want control. And so, as professionals, we want to be in control of the work that is our responsibility. If we're delegating our own work to someone else, we can't have that control. And so that sets up that kind of tension. And the thing I always say to people is to remember back to when you didn't get a chance to delegate anything because you had no one to delegate to. You at the start of your career. And most people can remember times at the start of their career when they thought they knew how to do something better than the way their boss did it.
Yeah.
And now they've come further in their career, they've come forward, they will recognize that sometimes they were wrong, but sometimes they are actually right. And therefore, look at the people around you who you're responsible for, who you supervise. Some of those will have good ideas about ways to do things which are very different to the way you would do them. And some of those ideas will yield better results than you could produce, either demonstrably better quality, more innovative thinking, or possibly just getting the same job done in a different and maybe slightly quicker, slightly smarter way. Everything changes. I know accountancy is a relatively slow mover, and tax only changes when the Chancellor changes his or her mind. But there are always going to be new ideas, and they're largely going to come from the people at the bottom of the organisation because they're younger, fresher, and less prejudiced by the years of experience.
Yeah, you know what
that control.
Yeah, it's so true. Actually, I mean, even thinking about my relatively short career at the moment, I mean, I used to hate it when I thought I could do something in a different or maybe even better way to someone else, and then they would change it. And I suppose even now I have people to delegate to, I must say I'm probably guilty of stopping their different ways of doing things as well because of that control aspect. It's quite difficult to get over, isn't it? Have you got any thoughts on how people can let go and trust other people rather than have to keep the control themselves on something?
It's very difficult. One of the things I think about anyone who's in a professional career, like an accountant or tax advisor or whatever, is that you become successful in the first instance by being technically excellent.
Yeah.
And then someone recognizes that and thinks, we've got to promote this person. They're good. And so they promote you into a responsibility where you're responsible for other people. You've got people to manage and supervise. But you've been promoted to manage and supervise, but what you're good at is doing. And so I remember a time when I was complaining to one of my bosses. I'd been given leadership of a moderate sized team. And I said, the problem is, I get into work, I've got all this stuff on my plate, all my to-do list, and they just keep coming and asking questions. And he said, look, we promoted you to manager. What is your job? And it suddenly struck me, my job is to manage those people. It is not to do the stuff that's on my plate. I have to find a way to fit it in, or I have to find a way to delegate it, but my job is those people. And so the way to give up control is to recognize the thing that you are now supposed to be controlling is the work of your team, not your work. And the way you will be successful is when your team is successful. If your team is not successful, no matter how good you are technically, once you've got a managerial responsibility, you won't be promoted. You might be booted into a back room and given a big salary because you're so technically proficient on this particular article of tax law, but your career as a manager will be over if your team's not successful. So the control you should have is over the outputs and the outcomes that your team is able to generate, not the work, not the individual pieces of work that you might or might not do yourself.
Yeah, it's definitely an important realization, isn't it? Kind of noticing the difference between what your role was before and what it is now. And I suppose what also doesn't help is a lot of people don't really get any training. They just get moved suddenly into this new job with different needs. And that probably makes it harder as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I'm interested to hear that's just the same now, and it's just the same in the tax profession as it was, 25 years ago when I was in the consultancy part of a Deloitte, and it was true throughout Deloitte at the time, and I won't pass comment on what I suspect is true now, but it's certainly a common problem that professionals are promoted on their technical merits and very rarely given the management training. And I think that's why I'm finding it is so rewarding to be providing online training, because when I was at the start of my career, I wanted to be a project manager. And my boss says, well, you don't have any project management training. I said, well, send me on some. He said, well, we can't. There is no project management training to send you on. There is no budget. There's no courses. And I couldn't, at that time, just go home in the evening, find a course that I like the look of, sign up for it, and start taking it 2 or 3 lectures a night to fit in with my lifestyle. Now, lots of people are doing that, and they're asking fantastic questions on the courses, and they're enthusiastic and they're motivated, and they recognise that investing in themselves is the way to build a career.
It is, absolutely. And if you don't do that, really, you kind of shunt your growth at some points anyway, don't you? And kind of how far you can go in your career. Because a lot of people who get promoted into those managerial roles will probably want to keep going, won't they? You go on, sorry, Mike.
Yeah, well, there's a book. There was a book in the 50s called The Peter Principle, which said that people are promoted to the level of their incompetence, which basically means, you promote someone to the point where they can't do the job, and then they just get stuck there until they're sacked. If you want to avoid getting to a point where you run out of competence, you have to continue to invest in yourself and your career. It's not just the technical briefings on new elements of tax law. It's all the different challenges that are going to be facing you next year that are not the same as the challenges that faced you this year. And I think, you're running a podcast. I mean, no doubt that's good experience for you, but just thinking about your listeners, they have chosen to give some of their time to listening to the people you interview, and they will do better than their peers who are choosing just to go home and watch some telly and not learn. So I think it's absolutely right that you need to invest in your career constantly, because things are not like they were even 40, 50 years ago, when you could have a job for life and not need to worry. Your company would sort you out with the training you need.
I completely agreed. And, one of the more important skills, I personally think anyway, is delegation, because if you don't master that skill, then you'll just become more and more busy. And that makes it harder and harder to learn the next skills you need to get to that next grade as well. So it's kind of one of those important ones to master early on, I think. As soon as you get into that managerial position, learn it. I mean, would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. Because, I mean, there are a lot of skills to master at the start of a managerial career. But if you think about what your job is, it's as I say, to get your team to deliver results through your team. And so part of that is about creating a mechanism for managing your workload and theirs. And that kind of efficiency, that kind of effectiveness requires that if you're going to put more and more of your time into developing and supporting them, they need to carry some of the weight of the work that you might otherwise be doing, to free you up to do the really important stuff that they can't do, which is lead the team and develop themselves and their colleagues.
Agreed. So one of the issues I've personally found with delegating is you've delegated a task to someone. You think you've given clear instructions, but then the work comes back and then you end up redoing the work yourself anyway, because it's not what you expected. So really, although the work might have been a little bit helpful, you still got to do the main bulk of the work yourself. Are there any ways that you can kind of avoid that scenario?
I think a lot of people think if I delegate some work, I can save some time. And that's certainly true, but it's like delegation's like any investment. You've got to put the money in up front. In this case, you've got to put the time in up front. And so if you want someone to become excellent at doing a piece of work that you have learned to do yourself, you've got to give them time to do that, which means you can't expect it to come back absolutely right first time, every time. You first of all have to invest the time to brief them well, to make sure they're absolutely clear about not how to do it, because that's instructing rather than delegating. There will be some instruction in there, but about what it is, what good looks like. I would say that the test that we should be allowing people to make for themselves is, have I done an excellent job? And the only way they'll be able to answer that is if they know what an excellent job looks like. So you have to be very clear. Some people won't want to do an excellent job, and you'll find out who they are soon enough. But most people do. And the only way they'll be able to do an excellent job is if you tell them what excellent looks like. So be very clear what the criteria are upon which you will assess their work. Give them enough background information and context so that they can They can answer questions for themselves. They know the issues, the situation, and be very clear with them what the deadlines are, how much authority they've got to do stuff, and what where the limits are beyond which they need to ask you. So it's about making a good investment, and that's all about doing the research, doing the preparation, and then putting the time in.
Yeah, so I'd say some people actually, before they actually delegate something, they probably don't know what good looks like themselves. And by the sounds of it, that's a mistake of the delegator. They should first find out what good looks like before they delegate it, to try and avoid that situation as much as possible.
I think it's an excellent point. We're used to doing stuff ourselves and thinking, well, that's good enough. But we never really think, you know what, if I were objective, how would I assess that work that I've done? And that's back to the point I made. Sometimes if you set people the right standards, and you give them the right incentives, they'll probably put in a better job than you would have done, because you just kind of got a little bit lazy, a little bit complacent about how to do it.
Agreed. And I think it's a really important point as well that you made about dedicating the time to train the people who you're delegating to. I think a lot of people don't do that because they just get worried that it might be a waste of time, or maybe that the person will leave the job, etc. So I think it is definitely important, isn't it, to dedicate that time to help them grow and to help them be a good person to delegate to.
It is, because if you don't train them well and they're not good at the job, you're going to wish they'd leave, and they won't. So you're better off having someone who can leave the organisation because they're moving up in their career, and they can leave thinking of you as someone they can respect. Funny enough, just before the lockdown, I don't know when you're planning to put this podcast out, but a lot of your listeners will, even if they're listening in 3-4 years' time, will remember the lockdown when we were all sheltering at home. Just before that, I did a seminar for some people on networking. So they were young career professionals, and they said, well, how do I get to meet all the senior people I need to meet? And I said, don't worry about them. At the moment, you're not going to influence them. They might come to you, but you're not going to influence them. The people you're going to influence are the people at your level. But here's the thing. If you continually do good for the people around you, and in the context we're talking about, if you delegate really good, interesting work to the people who work for you, and you supervise them well, you give them good training, and they develop, and they then leave the organization, in 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years' time, you could still be a senior practitioner in tax advice. They could be a tax accountant at a big firm, and suddenly you find that they're coming to you and your firm for advice and offering you work, because they remember that relationship that you built with them and the way you treated them. So being a professional is a long-term game. And so investing your time in your team is the best investment you can make, because they may seem to you like junior people now who don't have a lot of leverage, but in 10, 15 years' time, some of them are going to be big players in big organizations, and those relationships will be hugely valuable to you as a professional.
It's amazing actually how much a lot of things as being a professional always come back to building relationships. Even just talking about delegation now, it's linking back into building relationships. It's literally the most important thing about being a professional, isn't it, really? Because if you've got no relationships, then no one's ever going to want to work with you or buy your services.
It's no good having the cleverest way to shelter someone lawfully from tax if nobody wants to speak to you because they don't like you.
Exactly. So I think we kind of touched upon it a bit already, but are there any tasks that you should avoid delegating because of whatever reason that may be? Is there any tasks that are like that?
Yeah, the crap. Don't give people tasks that you really wouldn't want to do yourself and call it delegation. It's okay if you are a leader and a senior leader at that, and there's stuff that needs to get done, and you choose to a leadership style, which is that you'll get other people to do the difficult work for you, but don't call it delegation. Don't pretend it's developmental. Call it what it is, which is getting someone to do your dirty work for you. Don't delegate the crap. And actually, I say that in semi-seriousness, but my fundamental belief is the best way to lead is to be a servant leader, and as leaders we take on we take on the rubbish tasks so that our team can get on with doing the important work, and we give them the time and space to do their work as a leader by sheltering them from the nonsense that big organizations throw at us. So don't delegate the crap. But the other thing I would say is don't set people up to fail. Think very carefully. This isn't necessarily about what not to delegate, but it's the combination of what and who. Think very carefully about the work that you might want to delegate and who you might want to delegate it to, and be clear that if you brief them well and support them appropriately and they act diligently within their capabilities, they have the ability to turn in excellence. If you give someone a piece of work where you kind of know that they're not going to do a great job, then you're setting them up to fail, and it's entirely your fault if they do, and it's irresponsible, not only in your relationship with them, but in your relationship with your organization and your clients.
Mm-hmm. I think that kind of leads nicely on to my next question anyway, and we have kind of touched upon this already. It's kind of, when should you give someone a task that's beyond their capability, and how far past their capability should it be for them? Because if you give them an impossible task and set them up to fail, as you just said, it's just going to probably demotivate them, isn't it? And what they come back with is probably just going to frustrate you as well. So when should you give someone a task above their capabilities, and how should you help them with that?
So there is a kind of picture people often draw in training courses of where you've got this kind of little circle in the middle of the picture, which is called the comfort zone, where we're doing stuff which we can do comfortably and easily. And then there's a kind of big circle around it. And outside that circle, we call the panic zone, where it's too scary. We don't know what we're doing. We're struggling. And some people will succeed and some won't, and it'll be almost entirely unpredictable. But in between is the zone of the stretch zone, where we're stretching people's ability. They're doing something that they can't comfortably do, possibly they can't yet do, but it is within their capabilities. They've got all the background, they've got all the intellectual capacity to do it. They've got the personal resilience and tenacity to do it. So therefore, what we have to do is know our people. We have to know where their limits are. We don't learn when we do something familiar, and we also start to get bored when we do something familiar, because it's familiar, so we can do it, and therefore our brains have got spare capacity, and in that spare capacity we're thinking about what we're going to do after work, and what job I'd rather have than this. If on the other hand you put somebody too far out into the panic zone, then their mind is occupied by the fear of failure, and that distracts them from focusing on the work and doing a good job. So it's about finding that zone in the middle where it will take all of their attention and a big chunk of their experience and knowledge and a bit of creativity to figure out how to do it. So the first thing is set people work in that stretch zone and understand them and the work well enough so that you match up to do that. And the second is to let people know that, and I would quite happily share that model with someone. If I were delegating to you and I thought, maybe it's a bit close to that margin and maybe that's going to scare you a bit, I'd share the model with you and say, look, if I've got it wrong, if you feel like, the undercurrent is carrying you under and out to sea, then start waving, and I will come and I will answer your questions and lend you a hand, and we'll figure out how to keep you afloat and move forward. So it's letting people know when you're taking them close to that edge, that you're aware that they're close to that edge. It's a sign that you're trusting them. Not you let them know that's because you trust them, not because you want to set them up to fail. And therefore, if they feel they need to ask for help, you will respect that as self-awareness rather than deprecate that as a failing in their ability to do it.
Yeah, so it sounds like, as my own little summary there, it's kind of assessing, even though the person may not have done this task before, that they have the skills to be able to do it, and then also offer them a helping hand so that if it is too much for them, that they know that they can come and get support so they don't get undertaken by the current, as you put it.
Yeah, and then once they get going, take an interest in the work they're doing, but not in an intrusive way that comes across, I'm not sure I trust you, so I'm checking up on you, but more as I promised to support you through this. So tell me how you're getting on and what challenges you're facing. And if you've got challenges, what help do you need, or would you feel comfortable, tackling them yourself? Give people that choice. Clearly, if you sense that they are not self-aware enough to realize they're struggling and in danger of making some mistakes that are unacceptable mistakes in the context, then you've got a right and a responsibility to step in and suggest to them, what their next step should be. But by and large, if you start to trust people, they will be very well aware of where they are in that kind of comfort zone picture. And if they are too far out, they will tell you that, and you can help them.
I must admit, I do find that line about being too intrusive a very hard line to know where it is, where it is sometimes. I probably go overboard offering too much help and support, and they're probably thinking just go away. But I suppose it comes with practice, doesn't it, really? That one, knowing how much to offer.
Yeah. There's, you mentioned that I've got a course on delegation. I've also got a course on situational leadership, day-to-day leadership, which tackles that very, very point that, if you give too much support to somebody who doesn't feel they need it, not only is there a risk they'll resent it, but you're also using up time that you could spend on giving more support to people who do need it and do want it and will value it. So it's about being very clear with people what that approach you're taking is, so that they can guide you into how much support they want and need.
Absolutely. So then when it does come to delegation then, and you think you've got a piece of work that you want to delegate to someone, are there any kind of set steps that you would follow, or at least guide you to make sure that you give them all the information they need and, you've explained everything properly, etc.?
Well, I use an acronym, which is BOAT-TAR, not a particularly good acronym, but it helps me remember. I use acronyms a lot I used acronyms a lot when I was learning this stuff and trying to remember it, and I use it a lot in training. So BOAT are the 4 essential things you need to stay afloat. So you need to tell people the background, the context to what they're doing, so that they can understand why you're asking them to do it, and they can perhaps get a sense of what some of the answers are going to be to questions that you didn't answer in detail. Secondly is be very clear what outcomes you're expecting, and what is excellent look like, what does adequate look like, and where's the boundary between acceptable and not acceptable. But put the focus on, what excellence looks like, so they know that they can calibrate their work to achieve the level of excellence that they want to achieve. And also be very clear with them, you're not looking for perfection. If someone tries to deliver perfection, then they're going to spend a lot of time. So overshooting on the quality standards is, I think, as much of a problem organisation as undershooting. So let them know where the sweet spot is. Next, so we've done background and outcomes. Next is A for authority. If you're a tax advisor, I suppose the ultimate in delegation is saying, here's my client, this is what they need to know, and I'll give you full authority to consider the situation and then advise them directly in writing on headed paper. But that might not be the authority you're prepared to grant to a particular individual in a particular case. Maybe the authority you're granting is far more limited. It's think through the issue, list the relevant tax legislation that bears upon the case, and give me your suggestions for the key recommendations we might make to our client. That's an entirely lower level of delegation. It's entirely safe as far as the reputation is concerned. Nobody's going to get any hurt if they get it wrong. So somewhere on that spectrum from do a small piece of work and check with me to do the whole thing and send it out with a forged copy of the partner's signature. Somewhere on that spectrum is the right level of authority, and be very clear where that is, particularly where if they misunderstand their level of authority, they can get into a pickle. And finally is timescales. What is the deadline for this? And what are the dates that they need to be mindful of so that they can comply with those? So that's your boat. That keeps you afloat. Sometimes you need to keep it watertight. So you may need to spell out specific tasks. And this is particularly the case if they're working within a kind of regulated framework where there is no scope for imagination and new ways of doing things. There are specific tasks that have to be done, and they have to be done in a certain way. Then make sure they're aware of those. So that's T for tar. The A is admin. If there's any checkpoints that need to be made, if there's any admin they need to do, forms to fill out, be very clear about that. And R is for resources. For example, you might point a new, very junior member of the team at particular reference documents and or websites where they can go to find the information they need, or it may be about people they can call upon for advice, or as you move up and they move up in your career, you might be saying you might be a senior manager or partner, delegating work to a manager and saying, here are 2 or 3 people whose time you can use to discharge this piece of work. So boats tar.
I think when it comes to timescale, sometimes I am guilty of saying something along the lines of, it's not urgent, but we'll probably need it in a few weeks' time. Is that a bad idea when it comes to delegation? Because it kind of takes away the urgency a bit, doesn't it?
Well, saying it's not urgent, yes. And that's fine. If it isn't urgent and we need it in a couple of weeks' time, I don't need it for a couple of weeks, that's absolutely the right thing to do, to tell people that. The mistake you made is to not be clear the point at which you want to review so that they can actually schedule it. If you say we don't need it for a few weeks, then I don't know when to schedule it in my diary. I don't know when the drop dead date is. If you don't need it for 2 or 3 weeks, say I don't need it for 2 or 3 weeks. Let's have a checkpoint on Friday the 15th, and that will give us another week to polish it up and get it out, should the client say that they need it by the 22nd. If they need it later than that, then we can just put it in a drawer and wait and review it again nearer the time. But I'm all for helping people to understand the priorities and the urgencies in their professional lives, because too many managers tell you that every piece of work they give you is urgent and top priority. And if you are one of those people who happens to be working for 2 or 3 different managers who do that, you've no idea what to do. And I hope you're not and your listeners aren't in organizations where some managers will do that and others won't. Others will do what you do, which is to say this isn't urgent. And then, of course, you get people pushing their work to the fore where it oughtn't to be. So be very specific about deadlines. And if you don't need it for 3 weeks, say, let's have a review in 3 weeks, or I need to see it in 3 weeks. But don't say, I don't need it for a while, so it's not urgent, because then I don't know when to put it in my diary, when to schedule it. And it'll just get pushed back and back.
Yeah, so set some form of timescale, even if you are notifying them that it's not urgent.
Yeah.
I've definitely experienced people telling me things are urgent when they're not before, and then you do it quickly, you're waiting for the review, and then 2 weeks later, you're thinking, this was urgent 2 weeks ago, where's it gone? It's just frustrating for the person being delegated to, isn't it, if you do that as well? Yeah,
and I always wonder whether that's actually a sign of disorganized thinking on that manager's part, or whether actually it's a lack of trust, that if I tell you I don't need it for 3 weeks, that you'll do it in 3 weeks. So I'll tell you I need it in 1 week, and then I've got 2 weeks of spare. And some people we need to do that with. I won't pretend otherwise. But but again, it is a trust issue there.
Yeah, and just coming back to the first A, which was authority, I believe, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that one's a really useful one for people who work in tax, because when you take on a new person who's not worked in it before, you just can't expect them to go and draft an advice letter, can you, straight from scratch on a subject they know nothing about. But what you can do is break it down into smaller chunks where they could be helpful. So they could do a bit of research on one area of the advice and then come back to you on that. Then break it down that way. They've got enough authority to test them a bit, but not too much that they're going to get swamped by thinking, how on earth am I going to pull together this advice letter?
Exactly. And of course, they can know, and they should know, that doing that preliminary research is valuable, because partly it's about them learning, but also because things change from quarter to quarter, year to year. It may be that they can, in their research, find something that you might not have considered if you've done it without doing the research afresh yourself.
Absolutely.
So it's good. It's good work to delegate.
So I'm definitely going to start using that acronym anyway, because I think that's going to benefit me as well as hopefully the listeners as well.
Good.
So one concept I did see from the delegation course was this idea of reverse delegation. Could you just give a little bit of an explanation of what that is?
Yeah, well, I'm not going to take the credit for this. This credit goes to William Onken Jr., who came up with this metaphor. And we all experience it. And at the start of our careers, we experience it from our bosses. But as we become those bosses, we do it ourselves. We're walking down the corridor and we bump into someone. And they say, Mike, I'm kind of glad I bumped into you. I've got this problem. Have you got a moment? And it's happened to me, and I've gritted my teeth because I know that being a good manager is more important than the thing I'm in a hurry to do. So I'll say, what's the issue? And they'll explain something that's big and complicated. And because I'm in a rush and I don't want to look like I'm leaving them in the lurch, I'll just say, leave it with me. And William Onken referred to this as like they had a monkey on their shoulder. And now you're saying, leave it with me. That monkey's on your shoulder now, and it's going to be nagging you and pulling at your hair. So you get back to your office, and you dump this monkey on your desk along with all the other monkeys that you've picked up around the office over the last few days and weeks. And right at the back of the desk, there's these poor little monkeys, which are your own, who aren't getting a look in. So that's what I think you're referring to when you talk about reverse delegation. Getting delegated to by your people.
It's a good point you make when you're in a rush as well, because it's kind of I suppose a short-sighted view sometimes, isn't it? Saying leave it with me because you think that's good for now because I can get to the task that I want to do, but then in the long run, you've just taken on a time-consuming task.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of why it's a problem, I suppose, isn't it? Really, but is there any ways that it can be avoided?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I think the technique that Onken suggests is the first thing you have to do is to name the monkey, actually give it a name. And Onken said that, the real nature of this monkey is it is the next step. And you used the example of getting a new person to write do some research. The monkey is the next step in the task. No matter how big and complicated the whole task is, there's always a next step. And if you define that next step to be small enough and narrow enough, you can usually say, here's the next step, and I'd like you to go and do it, and I'd like you to come back to me at 4:00 on Thursday afternoon, and we will discuss it, and we'll discuss what after that. So instead of accepting that monkey, define that monkey very narrowly so that you can actually give it back to that person, but turn a big, amorphous, complex thing. I had a phone call from a client, and they want a whole new tax strategy for 2021. And you can turn that into a very specific thing that you can give to them entirely safely. It's not going to put them and their career at risk. It's not going to put you as their manager at risk, and it's not going to put the firm or the client at risk. So in that circumstance, okay, they need a strategy for 2021. So I'd like you to gather together all the papers about the strategy. We've advised them. I'd like you to make a list of all the changes in tax legislation and look at all of that, and then we'll sit down and come up with a program of work together. And that way, you've put the next step back with them. You've controlled when you're going to deal with it to fit into your schedule. You've made them feel like you've supported them, and yet they've gone away with a piece of work they feel confident they can do. It's a win all round.
I suppose they appreciate that you've taken a bit of overwhelm from them as well in that circumstance, because initially they're probably panicking, thinking, how am I going to do this? And as soon as you've broken it down into something simple that they understand and know they can do, I suppose it's building that relationship on both sides again, isn't it? Coming back to relationships.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really nice point about relating it to overwhelm. We feel overwhelmed when we don't feel like we've got control of our work because we don't know quite where to start, or it feels like there's too much. And it's exactly what you're doing. You're telling them where to start, and you're making it manageable for them.
Absolutely. So we've already talked about that it's important to kind of dedicate the time to train your staff that you're delegating to. So then kind of an obvious lead onto that, I suppose, is giving people feedback. And it sounds like feedback is definitely important when it comes to delegation as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's how a lot of your listeners, I think, are going to be at some point wanting to make a transition from being a smart young tax professional who has done their exams, is fully up to date with the legislation, knows, all the kind of craft of tax advice, and they want to transition from that to being the sort of person that has a reputation in the firm, has a reputation with clients, perhaps even has a reputation in the industry. People will come and they'll say, you know what, I want to hear what Jack thinks about this. And that's the transition that I refer to as going from smart to wise. Mm-hmm. And how do we make that transition? I think the principal way we make that transition is by reflecting on our experiences and understanding what we've done and the impact it's had and how it's worked out, whether that's a decision we've made that's gone well or a decision that's gone badly, whether it's a piece of work we've done that has succeeded or a piece of work that has downright failed. It's that reflection process, and feedback from a manager in the hands of a skilled manager allows us the time to reflect and to understand and to internalize that, the learning that can be harvested from whatever we've just done, and turn that into a career asset.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I've got a completely separate episode that's going to be coming out on feedback, so I won't jump too much into it here, but a lot of people do fear feedback, I think, don't they? And I think people also fear giving it because they don't want to, hurt the other person or annoy them. So they kind of dance around the edges a bit, but presumably precise, accurate and truthful feedback is going to be the most helpful in these circumstances to learn from.
Well, I like a model which comes out of positive psychology, which says that if you want to take someone from being an unskilled or poor performer of any sort to an average, competent, basic performer, then your feedback needs to be weighted towards correcting the mistakes they make, and helping them to understand what good looks like and how to do it right. But once someone is at that basic level, giving them that kind of critical feedback, which said, well, you made that mistake and here's how to fix it, actually isn't going to get them to excellence. The kind of feedback that gets them to excellence, and that's from that point, is actually the positive feedback that reinforces the things they did well and helps them to understand why it worked and how to turn an instinct or an idea or an insight into a repeatable process so they can sharpen their performance. Because once people get to a certain level, they know the mistakes they made and they don't need you to tell them. There's a lovely story about Ernest Shackleton, who led an expedition to the South Pole. And on the way down to the South Pole, one of his men made a mistake, and a load of gear went overboard. And this huge long line of stuff went overboard. And one of Shackleton's senior officers, they all called him the boss. He said the thing about the boss is, as soon as this happened, he rolled up his sleeves and he was there with the men, helping to recover the situation, getting us cold, getting us wet, getting us as injured as everyone else was. And at the end, he didn't say anything because he knew that the man knew he'd made a mistake. And everyone realized that this poor chap was suffering more because he wasn't reprimanded, and Shackleton kind of ignored it and let him get on with it, than actually if he'd have told him off. When we get to a certain level of capability and competence, we don't need someone to tell us we've made a mistake. What we actually need is someone to point out what was particularly helpful and how we can do it even more effectively next time.
So even where you find someone then they have made a mistake, and even if you don't point it out to them, is there any merit in giving them something constructive that they can do to not make that in the future, or do you think that's still as bad as pointing it out?
You know what? If they've made a mistake and they don't know it, you do need to point it out clearly. But if they've made a mistake and they know it, and you want to be sure that they're learning from it, you could ask them what steps they would take to avoid it in future, and they will probably give you a perfectly good answer. And then you nod sagely and you say that's right.
I suppose it comes down to not being patronising, isn't it, in those circumstances, really, as well.
Yeah.
So just to wrap up then, we've talked through quite a lot of points here about delegation. We've talked about kind of your strategy to help delegate better and so on. Have you got any final tips you would give people when it comes to delegation to help them to improve?
I think for me, it's about thinking about delegation as a tool that supports one of your absolute strategic priorities as a manager and as a leader, whether you're leading a small team or a business, which is to make your business resilient against all reasonably foreseeable setbacks. And curious time to be saying that, but and I think if you look at a professional practice like a tax practice of any sort, I think the two obvious setbacks that the business is likely to have, whether it's at a team level or at a business level, is peaks in the workload, some of which are you can anticipate because obviously there is a tax cycle throughout the year. But there are workload peaks because clients come on and they go. And then there are unplanned absences, which include yours as the team leader. So you've got to build a resilience in your team. And if you can look at your team as a whole and say, how can I develop resilience amongst that team so that I can handle workload peaks, I can handle absences, I could step out of the business for 6 weeks and name my deputy into my place and know that actually everyone can step up and get the work done. If you can do that, then you have a team that can manage without you. That's the point where your bosses will say, you know what, it's perfectly safe to promote you, Jack, because we can backfill you. If you're in a team and your team is absolutely reliant on you to be there, then nobody's going to promote you because it's too risky. We promote you, and then the team falls apart, and we've got a hole in our organisation. So build a delegation program that builds that resilience, and in so doing, you will build the pipeline of succession that will allow the partners in your organization and the directors and leaders in your organization to look at you as someone who can build something of value and it is also safe to promote to the next level.
Really interesting point. Actually, I've never really thought about delegation as building resilience in a team, but clearly it does, doesn't it?
Mm.
Okay, then. So where can the audience learn more about you then, Mike? Anywhere to send them in particular?
Okay, so if they are interested in my online training, there are a number of different sources. For basic management training, my website, mikeclayton.co.uk, has a link to the courses that I make available. Those courses are also available on several other platforms.
Okay.
And if they're also if you're interested in management training, I'm increasingly putting more of my management training onto YouTube for free. I have recently started this year, started investing significantly in building a YouTube channel called Management Courses. So if you find the YouTube channel Management Courses, you'll find an increasing amount of content, which is entirely free, subsidized by sitting through adverts that you don't really want to sit through, but that's fine. You can stop them after 5 seconds. So if you're interested in general management, then that's the way to go. There are obviously, if you go to Amazon and put Mike Clayton in, you'll find there's at least 14 print books and a number of ebooks available with my name on them. And if any of your listeners are interested in project management, then I'd encourage them to go to onlinepmcourses.com and the Online PM Courses YouTube channel, where there's a lot of free project management stuff. And of course, I'm a professional, and therefore networking, as we've both agreed, is vital. And so if any of your listeners like the sound of what I had to say and think, you know what, it'd be cool to connect with Mike, then just find me on LinkedIn and tell me why you know my name, rather than just send a blank request, and I will accept every link from a bona fide professional.
That's excellent. Thanks, Mike. I will put links into the show notes anyway, so if
Perfect.
you haven't taken those down, people can find them there. And thank you very much for coming on the show today, Mike. It's been a very interesting episode, and I think I've taken away a lot of useful points as well, so I'm sure everyone else would have done the same.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you for having me, Jack.
Thanks, Mike. Some great advice from Mike there. I hope you found the episode as useful as I did. If nothing else, I suggest you take away these 3 points from this episode. The first is Mike's description of delegation. That is, entrusting your work to someone else. The second is to try out the acronym BOTAR the next time you delegate. BOTAR stands for background/context, outcomes, authority, timescales/deadlines, admin, and resources. The third is to avoid a situation of reverse delegation. Resist saying, leave it with me, and instead define a next step for the delegatee or organise a time when this next step will be given. You can find links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as where to find further information about Mike in the show notes at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP4. TTPP4 stands for The Tax Professionals Podcast, Episode 4. On the website, you can also subscribe to the podcast or for email notifications to make sure you're always informed of future episodes. That's it for this episode. Until next time.